There is a silent moment when a human being betrays themselves. It's not when you fail in public, nor when you are defeated by external forces. True betrayal happens in the intimate moment when you know what you should do, and choose not to do it. In that instant, something breaks inside. It's not morality that is lost, it's self-respect. Friedrich Nietzsche walked in this dangerous territory where few dare to remain. He didn't speak of discipline as obedience nor as empty rigidity, but as an internal pact between what you are and what you are willing to become. Where there is no discipline, his philosophy implicitly stated, there is no form. And where there is no form, chaos reigns disguised as freedom. Most people believe that discipline is a punishment imposed on desire. Nietzsche saw the opposite. Discipline is the highest act of self-love that a strong spirit can exercise. Not sentimental love, but tragic, lucid love, the kind that accepts the weight of its own greatness. Ask yourself with brutal honesty, if you cannot govern your simplest impulses, how dare you desire a high life? This question cuts through Nietzsche and thought like a blade. The undisciplined man is not free. He is predictable, reactive, a slave to the next stimulus, the next pleasure, the next escape. Nietzsche observed the world as one contemplates a theater of forces. For him, each human being is a battlefield between lower impulses and the possibility of self-creation. Discipline in this scenario is not repression. It is transmutation. It is inner alchemy. It is taking the raw impulse and molding it into creative power. The weak spirit avoids discipline because it demands confrontation. Confrontation with one's own laziness, with one's own excuses, with the comfortable narrative of victimhood. The noble spirit, however, understands that all elevation requires renunciation, focus, and continuity. Not out of duty, but out of dignity. There is a spiritual dimension to this process that few understand. Nietzsche didn't speak of outward transcendence, but of inward ascension. Becoming who you are requires a loving severity towards yourself. Discipline in this sense is a daily ritual of alignment between will and action. When this alignment breaks down, resentment arises. The individual begins to hate what they admire, to attack what they cannot sustain. Not out of malice, but out of an inability to remain true to themselves. How many times have you admired strength, constancy, greatness, and at the same time felt a silent irritation in their presence? Nietzsche saw in this phenomenon a clear symptom of decadence. The absence of discipline not only generates external failure, it corrodes the core of being. Without discipline, the individual begins to negotiate with himself. Early this morning, maybe tomorrow. Just this once. And each small concession undermines inner respect. The body feels it. The mind knows it. The spirit registers it. Nothing goes unnoticed. Discipline is, therefore, a language you speak to yourself. When you abandon it, the message is clear. You are not reliable even to yourself. There's a question that runs through this reflection like a contained thunderclap. Would you live under the leadership of someone exactly as you are today? Nietzsche would provoke mercilessly. If the answer is no, then something demands transformation. And this transformation will not come from fleeting motivation, nor from inspiring speeches. It is born from silent repetition, from the correct gesture made even when no one is watching. Discipline is this: acting as if your highest self were always present, observing. In Nietzschean thought, chaos is not eliminated. It is organized. You have to have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. But chaos without discipline only breeds ruin. The star is only born when chaos finds form. And form is built with constancy, with conscious choice, with self-imposed limits. Not limits that imprison, but limits that concentrate strength. Just as a river only becomes powerful because it accepts its banks, the individual only becomes respectable when they accept discipline as the structure of their own freedom. Perhaps the greatest modern misconception is confusing following impulses with authenticity. Nietzsche would never defend this confusion. For him, authenticity is fidelity to one's own potential, not submission to one's own comfort. To be disciplined is to say, my life will not be governed by chance, by the mood of the day, nor by the opinions of others. It will be shaped by a will that respects itself. And where there is respect, a silent force is born that does not need to prove itself. This first crossing offers no relief, only clarity. Discipline doesn't promise immediate happiness, but it builds something rarer: inner dignity. And once an individual experiences this dignity, they can no longer ignore the abyss that exists between who they are when they yield and who they could be when they endure. From here, there is no comfortable return. Only the question remains, echoing like an unsettling whisper: are you willing to become someone who respects themselves? Discipline, when observed from the outside, seems like a distant, almost abstract concept. But it reveals itself with brutal clarity in the small gestures of everyday life, where no one applauds and no one judges. Nietzsche would understand this scenario with surgical precision. He knew that the true measure of an individual does not appear in grand speeches, but in the banal moments when the will is tested in silence. The alarm clock rings, the body asks for a few more minutes, the mind invents sophisticated justifications. It is there, in that common instant repeated millions of times, that self-respect is affirmed or denied. Imagine someone walking the same route every day, carrying a weariness that doesn't come from excessive effort, but from a lack of direction. This person works, keeps to a schedule, answers messages, but feels a constant emptiness. Nietzsche would call this a reactive life, an existence guided by external stimuli, never by an organized will of their own. Indiscipline doesn't manifest as rebellion, but as dispersion. The person doesn't choose, they respond. They don't create, they react. And little by little, without realizing it, they lose the sense of authorship over their own life. There's something almost invisible in this process. The individual begins by promising themselves that tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow there will be focus. Tomorrow there will be consistency. Tomorrow there will be courage. But tomorrow repeats itself like a cracked mirror. Each broken promise leaves a psychic residue, a silent distrust. Nietzsche saw a profound problem in this. When you repeatedly break your word to yourself, you fragment your own identity. Who are you, after all, if even you no longer believe in what you promise? In one of his most unsettling insights, Nietzsche suggested that human beings prefer the comfort of guilt to the responsibility of discipline. Blaming the world, the system, the past, or others is easier than sustaining a difficult choice every day. Consider these common scenarios. The person who says they want to change their body but compromises with laziness. The one who claims to seek mental clarity but drowns in distractions. The individual who speaks of greatness but avoids the silent effort it demands. There is no villainy in this. There is a lack of inner structure, a lack of self-respect. There is an almost mystical moment when this perception emerges, an instant when the individual observes themselves from the outside and asks, with discomfort, "Why do I keep sabotaging myself if I know exactly what I should be doing?" Nietzsche saw this question as a portal. Some retreat, numbing themselves with distractions. Others cross over, and crossing over means accepting an uncomfortable truth. No one will come to rescue you from your own indiscipline. There is no external master, miraculous method, or inspiring phrase that can replace the daily exercise of willpower. Discipline begins to manifest itself when someone decides to act without compromising with themselves. Not out of blind rigidity, but out of clarity. It is when the individual understands that each small choice shapes their self-image. By fulfilling what they promised, even in silence, something reorganizes itself internally. The body responds. The mind quiets down. A strange, almost forgotten sensation arises, the feeling of integrity. Nietzsche would call this the strengthening of the spirit. Not a mystical spirit separate from the world, but an internal coherence between wanting, deciding, and acting. There's a subtle shift at this point. Discipline ceases to be a burdensome effort and becomes an identity under construction. The person no longer thinks, "I need to do this," but "This is what someone like me does." This shift changes everything. The inner chaos doesn't disappear, but it begins to obey a hierarchy. Impulses cease to command. They begin to serve. This is how the average person slowly begins to become the author of their own life. Nietzsche saw in this process a form of modern asceticism, without temples and without dogmas. A practical spirituality, lived in everyday life, where each correct action is a silent affirmation of self-worth. Discipline, then, reveals its true face. It is not punishment, it is protection. Protection against internal dissolution, against chronic regret, against a life lived on autopilot. And when this understanding takes hold, something irreversible happens. The individual begins to realize that a lack of discipline has always had a cost, even when it seemed comfortable. An emotional, energetic, and existential cost. And this realization doesn't accuse, it awakens. As if an ancient voice, perhaps the same one Nietzsche heard while writing, whispered firmly, "You can continue living like this, but now you know the price." From that point on, indifference becomes impossible, and the path ahead, though demanding, begins to acquire a strange and silent dignity. There comes a point where indiscipline ceases to be merely a bad habit and transforms into a way of being. Nietzsche perceived this with unsettling clarity. It's no longer about occasional failure, but about organizing one's life around evasion. The individual begins to structure their days to never confront what demands consistency. They remain busy, but not committed, active, but not focused. And in this continuous escape, something more serious happens: the loss of the sense of weight of one's own existence. Life becomes too light, almost disposable. This state produces a silent phenomenon that Nietzsche would identify as decadence disguised as normality. The person laughs, socializes, consumes content, opines on everything, but avoids any practice that requires them to sustain themselves over time. Everything needs to be fast, immediate, comfortable. Discipline, because it demands continuity, begins to cause repulsion. Not because it is too difficult, but because it reveals a truth that many do not want to face. The truth that much suffering does not come from the world, but from one's own self-neglect. How many pains do you call bad luck, when in reality they are just overdue bills from your indiscipline? There is an even deeper consequence to this process. When someone avoids discipline long enough, they begin to develop resentment against those who possess it. Nietzsche described this mechanism with surgical precision. The individual begins to ridicule consistency, to call effort an obsession, to label self-discipline as excessive rigidity. It's an elegant psychological defense. If discipline is something negative, then not possessing it ceases to be a problem. But resentment doesn't fool the body or the conscience. It only temporarily numbs it. How long can you live attacking what, deep down, you know you need to develop? At this point, an unexpected twist occurs. Nietzsche didn't see discipline merely as a tool for producing external results, but as an instrument of revelation. When someone truly disciplines themselves, they begin to discover who they really are and who they are not. The masks fall, excuses lose their power. The person realizes that many narratives about themselves were just comfortable stories to justify their own stagnation. This revelation is not pleasant. It wounds the ego, but it also liberates, because it is only possible to shape what one knows. Would you be willing to lose the comfortable image you've created of yourself to discover your true measure? There is a specific type of loneliness that accompanies this process. It's not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of responsibility. Nietzsche walked alone for long periods, not out of misanthropy, but because he understood that certain decisions cannot be outsourced. Discipline places the individual face to face with themselves, without witnesses and without alibis. It is in this space that many retreat, not because of physical incapacity, but because of fear of taking command of their own lives. Because taking command means no longer being able to blame anyone. Do you realize how much the absence of discipline also functions as a hiding place? Over time, something curious happens. The disciplined person begins to develop a different presence. They don't talk much about their plans. They don't over-explain themselves. They carry a visible coherence between discourse and action. Nietzsche would see this as a sign of inner strength. Where there is discipline, there is economy of words. Where there is indiscipline, there is an excess of justifications. Observe carefully. Those who need to explain themselves too much are usually trying to convince themselves before convincing others. How many times have you explained your internal shortcomings as if they were virtues? There is also an unexpected revelation along this path. Discipline doesn't eliminate suffering, it chooses it. The individual ceases to suffer from chaos and begins to suffer from growth. This exchange changes everything. Suffering ceases to be a useless burden and becomes a sign of alignment. Nietzsche never promised comfort, he promised meaning. And meaning is born when effort has direction, when pain builds something, when sacrifice is not imposed from the outside but chosen consciously. Do you prefer suffering that builds or suffering that slowly corrodes? At this stage, life begins to acquire density. Days cease to be mere sequences of events and become training grounds for the will. Every small decision carries symbolic value. Discipline becomes a kind of silent vow renewed daily. There is no constant euphoria, but there is inner stability. Nietzsche would see in this the emergence of a rarer type of human being, one who does not need external approval to remain standing. But this stability comes at a high price. It demands that you abandon the version of yourself that always procrastinated. Are you prepared to say goodbye to that version? At the end of this journey, a truth emerges quietly. Discipline doesn't just transform what you do, it redefines who you tolerate being. Certain behaviors cease to be acceptable. Certain concessions become impossible, not out of moralism, but out of self-respect. And when this self-respect takes hold, it creates an irreversible distance between those who drift aimlessly and those who choose to sustain themselves over time. The remaining question is no longer whether discipline is worthwhile, but whether you can continue living without it, now that you clearly see what it truly reveals. There is a rare moment when discipline ceases to be merely an individual practice and reveals its almost invisible impact on people's destinies. Nietzsche observed this phenomenon with silent fascination. He perceived that disciplined individuals tend to be present at decisive crossroads in their own lives, while the undisciplined usually arrive after everything has already been decided, not through conspiracy, nor through external injustice, but through something simple and brutal. Those who maintain constancy are ready when life demands readiness. There are curious accounts that illustrate this with disconcerting precision. People who without grand planning were awake too early on the right day, who had trained when no one was watching, who had studied when it wasn't mandatory, and because of that, recognized an opportunity that others didn't even notice. Nietzsche would say that this is not luck, but affinity. Discipline creates a special sensitivity to the exact moment to act. Have you ever noticed how many opportunities go unnoticed not due to a lack of ability, but due to a lack of inner preparation? There are also improbable events that reveal the hidden cost of indiscipline. Stories of evident talents that never materialized. People praised from an early age, full of potential, but incapable of sustaining any project to the end. Nietzsche saw this as a modern tragedy, the waste of potential, not for lack of intelligence or resources, but for lack of structure. Talent without discipline does not mature, it rots. And the cruelest thing is that over time, the individual himself comes to hate what he could have been. In contrast, there is something almost mysterious about the way discipline reorganizes the world around those who practice it. People begin to trust more, even without knowing exactly why. Decisions become simpler. External chaos loses its power because the inner center is stable. Nietzsche would perceive here an unwritten law of existence. The world tests those who organize themselves internally, not to punish them, but to verify if the constructed form is real. How many times have you felt that life demanded more of you precisely when you began to take yourself seriously? There is also a curious fact that is rarely discussed. Disciplined people make fewer mistakes, but when they do, they learn faster. Not because they are superior, but because they keep an internal record of their own actions. Discipline creates memory. It prevents mistakes from dissolving into excuses. Nietzsche deeply valued this ability to learn from one's own journey. For him, to err without learning is merely to repeat the chaos. To err consciously is to hone the spirit. At this point in the journey, a silent transformation occurs. The individual begins to realize that discipline does not narrow life, it expands it. Contrary to what many imagine, It is not the absence of rules that generates freedom, but the presence of a chosen order. A disciplined person can improvise because they have a foundation. You can relax because you know how to recover. You can dare because you trust your own structure. Nietzsche would see this as a higher form of freedom, one that does not depend on favorable circumstances. There are even more unexpected reports. People who report feeling less anxiety when they adopt rigorous routines. Others who claim to rediscover pleasure in simple activities after establishing clear boundaries. This seems contradictory at first glance, but Nietzsche would understand perfectly. Anxiety arises from dispersion, pleasure arises from presence, and discipline focuses the individual on the present moment, removing them from constant fragmentation. Have you ever noticed how the mind calms down when it knows exactly what needs to be done? As this clarity sets in, something curious happens to time. It ceases to be an enemy and becomes an ally. The individual no longer feels the days slipping through their fingers. Each day fulfills a purpose. Each effort fits into a greater whole. Nietzsche would see in this a silent victory against modern nihilism, which transforms time into something empty. Where there is discipline, time regains weight, texture, and direction. Ultimately, what this stage reveals is a truth that is difficult to ignore. Discipline creates a field of gravity around the individual. Things begin to happen more coherently. Relationships adjust. Choices align. Not by magic, but because life responds to what is stable. And this stability is not rigidity, it is fidelity to oneself. Nietzsche would not call this success, but existential integrity. When an individual realizes all of this, something becomes impossible, pretending not to know. Discipline ceases to be an abstract option and becomes a criterion for spiritual survival. From this point on, not adopting it is a conscious choice for dispersion. And this awareness weighs heavily. It marks a clear boundary between those who accept shaping their own lives and those who continue to wait for something external to do it for them. The journey is now well advanced, and what lies ahead will require not only discipline, but also the courage to endure its consequences. There comes a point when discipline ceases to be a choice among many and becomes a dividing line. Nietzsche saw this moment as inevitable. It is no longer possible to float between effort and escape, between clarity and distraction. Life forces a definition. The individual realizes that they are being pushed to a silent limit, where they must decide who they will be when there are no more excuses available. This moment doesn't usually come with announcements. It infiltrates common situations, but carries an unusual weight. Tension begins when the old life tries to reassert itself. Old habits return with seductive arguments. Just today, just this once, you deserve to rest. Nietzsche would understand this movement as the last resistance of internal chaos. It is when comfort disguises itself as wisdom and weakness tries to negotiate its permanence. The body asks for relief. The mind offers elegant justifications. But something has changed. The individual already knows the cost of this negotiation, and this knowledge creates an internal conflict more intense than any physical effort. At this stage, a silent reversal occurs. Discipline ceases to depend on motivation. It begins to exist even in the total absence of willpower. The individual acts tired, acts without enthusiasm, acts without applause, and paradoxically, it is in this emotional void that real strength is consolidated. Nietzsche deeply valued this point, as it marks the transition between those who depend on internal states and those who govern their own conduct. Have you ever noticed how acting without willpower reveals more character than acting inspired? The pressure mounts because the world reacts. People close to you find the change strange. Some distance themselves, others test limits. Discipline is unsettling because it exposes. It shows without words that living differently is possible. Nietzsche saw this as an inevitable effect. When someone organizes themselves internally, they reveal the chaos around them. Not through judgment, but through contrast. And this contrast generates friction. Are you prepared to withstand this friction without backing down? There is a decisive moment when the individual realizes that they can no longer return to their previous state without feeling ashamed of themselves. Not social shame, but an intimate, silent shame, the kind that corrodes inner respect. Discipline creates a new standard. What was once acceptable now sounds too low. What once seemed normal now seems negligent. Nietzsche would call this the elevation of the internal standard. And this new standard does not accept frequent exceptions. It demands consistency. Tension reaches its peak when the most dangerous temptation arises. The idea that enough is enough. That sufficient progress has already been made. That it is now possible to relax the internal pact. Nietzsche would warn that this is precisely where many fall. Not in the initial difficulty, but in the false sense of accomplishment. Discipline interrupted at this point not only stagnates, it regresses with interest, because the individual already knows what it is to live with self-respect and consciously abdicates it. In this conflict, something profound is revealed. Discipline is no longer linked to external results, but to identity. The individual no longer asks what they will gain by acting correctly. They ask who they will become if they do not act. This inversion changes everything. Correct action ceases to be a means and becomes a reflex. Nietzsche would see in this the birth of a rarer type of human being, one who acts out of fidelity to their own form. The narrative accelerates because time seems different now. The days carry weight. Every choice weighs heavily. Every omission is felt. There is no longer enough anesthesia to ignore one's own wasted potential. Discipline transforms life into a constant dialogue between the present and the future. And the future begins to demand coherence. Have you ever felt the weight of knowing that you are exactly where your choices have placed you? At the limit of this process, the individual faces a truth that cannot be softened. Discipline does not promise emotional security. It promises integrity, and integrity demands the courage to uphold decisions even when they cost comfort, approval, or immediate rest. Nietzsche never promised an easy life. He pointed to a life worth living. Now, the journey is almost complete. The individual no longer asks if the discipline is too harsh. He asks if he is willing to live without it. The old self observes from a distance, becoming increasingly irrelevant. The new self is not yet fully formed, but it already demands commitment. The remaining tension is not external. It is internal, and it prepares the ground for the final revelation. The moment when discipline ceases to be a conscious effort and becomes an accepted destiny. At the end point of this journey, there are no fireworks or grand promises. There is only silence and truth. Nietzsche would understand this moment as the rarest of all, the one in which the individual stops searching for answers outside and finally accepts the responsibility of becoming what they can sustain. Discipline now no longer appears as effort, nor as constant struggle. It emerges as posture, as a way of being in the world, as silent self-respect. Everything said so far converges on something simple, yet demanding. Discipline begins when you decide to stop abandoning yourself, not in grand heroic gestures, but in the smallest choices repeated daily. Waking up when you promised, fulfilling what you agreed with yourself, ending the day with a clear conscience, even if imperfect. Nietzsche never believed in perfection. He believed in fidelity. Fidelity to one's own form, one's own rhythm, one's own potential. The practical path doesn't require complex rituals. It requires clarity. Choose one thing you will do every day, even when you don't want to. Just one. Small, concrete, non-negotiable. Not to impress anyone, but to restore trust between you and yourself. Discipline is born precisely there, when your word regains weight. When the body learns that the mind doesn't back down. When the spirit realizes it can trust the one who governs it. Nietzsche saw in this a spiritual reconstruction, not a spirituality of escape, but of presence. Discipline organizes internal chaos and transforms dispersed energy into directed force. You don't need to change everything. You need to sustain something, and by sustaining, you change. Real transformation isn't immediately visible, but it's felt. It appears in your posture, your gaze, the way you react to the world. Fewer justifications, less anxiety, more firmness. There will be difficult days, days when you will fail. And that doesn't invalidate the journey. Discipline doesn't demand infallibility. It demands return. Returning without drama. returning without self-punishment, returning with dignity. Nietzsche would understand this profoundly. Falling isn't the problem. Staying fallen is. Self-respect isn't lost in failure, but in silent surrender. Over time, something essential happens. You begin to feel pride not in what you show, but in what you uphold. A calm pride, without the need for applause. You realize you no longer need to prove yourself all the time. Discipline takes root, and those who take root are not carried away by any wind. At this stage, life may still be difficult, but it ceases to be confusing. There is direction, there is a center, there is meaning. This is the point where Nietzsche steps back and leaves you alone with yourself, not because you lack guidance, but because it has now been internalized. The final question is not philosophical, it's practical. What will you do tomorrow morning when no one is watching? That answer is worth more than any deep reflection, because it is in that answer that self-respect is confirmed or dissolved. If something inside you recognizes this truth, don't ignore it. Start small. Start today. Start quietly. Discipline doesn't ask for announcements. It asks for commitment. And that commitment, when sustained, transforms everything around you. Not spectacularly, but definitively. If this content resonated with you in any way, please like the video to reinforce this message. Comment on what made sense to you. You can do so anonymously if you prefer, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of clarity, inner strength, and real transformation. Discipline begins now, and this time it begins with respect for who you are and who you can become.